It was late evening when Emma and Daniel drove into the forgotten countryside of Yorkshire. The road was empty, the silence almost unnatural. Their GPS showed nothing but a blank stretch, yet somehow it insisted they had arrived. Before them stood an old Victorian house, tall and crooked, with broken shutters swaying in the wind. The glass windows were dark, but Emma felt a chill, like something, or someone, was staring back at her from inside. "Strange place for a cheap rental," Daniel muttered. Forcing a laugh, Emma didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the upstairs window, where for a split second, she thought she saw a shadow move. They carried their bags inside. The house smelled of damp wood and dust, yet the air felt heavier, almost as if the walls themselves were breathing. Every creak of the floor echoed through the empty halls like footsteps following. Too closely behind. "Feels like it's watching us," Emma whispered. Hugging her arms, Daniel chuckled nervously. "It's just an old house. Don't let it get in your head." But that night, as they settled into the master bedroom, Emma woke up suddenly. The curtains were moving, though the windows were shut tight. And there, through the thin fabric, she saw it. Two glowing eyes pressed against the glass from the outside, staring directly at her. When she blinked, they were gone. Yet in her heart, she knew the house was alive, and it was watching. "Come on," Daniel said, lifting the suitcase from the trunk. "It's just an old house. Probably creaks a lot, maybe drafty, but hey, we got it cheap. 2 nights and then we're back in London." Emma nodded, though uneasily. Cheap, that was the whole reason they were here. The listing had promised authentic countryside charm, though she couldn't imagine anyone calling this place charming. Still, their budget was tight, and this was all they could afford. As Daniel pushed the door open, it groaned loudly, echoing through the cavernous space beyond. The scent of damp wood and mold hit them immediately. Emma wrinkled her nose, but when she stepped inside, another feeling washed over her, something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the chill. It was as though the air itself pressed down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. The hallway stretched into shadow, lined with faded wallpaper that curled at the edges like peeling skin. The floorboards groaned beneath their weight, each step sending echoes through the emptiness. Emma's eyes swept over the high ceiling where cobwebs draped like curtains. Yet despite the neglect, the house didn't feel abandoned. It felt awake. Emma shivered and tightened her grip on the handle of her bag. For just a moment, she thought she heard something, a faint sound, almost like a sigh carried on the draft. She glanced at Daniel, but he was too busy fiddling with the light switch. The bulbs flickered weakly before casting a dim, yellow glow that barely pushed back the shadows. "See?" Daniel said, forcing cheer into his voice. "It's not so bad." But Emma wasn't convinced. Her gaze drifted toward the staircase that rose into the darkness above. She had the unsettling sensation that if she looked long enough, she might see someone or something standing at the top, waiting silently for them. Daniel carried the suitcase further into the hallway, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud, as if the walls themselves were repeating the sound back to them. Emma followed reluctantly, her eyes darting to every corner, half expecting something to move in the gloom. The hallway opened into a large sitting room. Dusty furniture sat beneath white sheets, their outlines like bodies covered for burial. A grand fireplace dominated the far wall, though the hearth was filled with ash that looked far too fresh for a place supposedly uninhabited. Emma knelt beside it, her fingers trembling as she touched the soot. It smudged her skin black. "Strange," she murmured. "Someone's been here." Daniel chuckled nervously. "Maybe the caretaker. Place like this probably needs someone to look in every now and then." But even as he said it, his tone carried no conviction. Emma stood, brushing her hands against her jeans, and glanced at the tall windows that lined the room. Their panes were grimy with dust, yet she could feel the cold night beyond pressing against them like an unseen face. For the briefest instant, she thought she saw the faintest outline of a handprint on the inside of the glass. Shaking the thought away, she followed Daniel as he carried their things upstairs. The staircase creaked and moaned beneath their weight, as though resenting their presence. The walls here were lined with old portraits, men and women dressed in somber Victorian attire, their painted eyes following with unnerving accuracy. Emma slowed, her heart skipping. One painting in particular caught her gaze. It was a woman in a dark dress, her features sharp and pale. But what unsettled Emma most was the eyes. They were painted so darkly, so deeply, it felt like staring into a pit. Daniel called from the landing above, jolting her from her trance. "You coming, or are you just going to admire the art?" She tore her eyes from the portrait and hurried after him, though she could have sworn the woman's expression had shifted ever so slightly. The master bedroom was surprisingly intact. Heavy curtains hung across the tall windows, blocking out most of the moonlight. The bed was old but neatly made, the quilt drawn tight across it. Emma ran her hand over the fabric. It was cold but not dusty, almost as if someone had smoothed it only hours ago. Her stomach twisted. "Daniel, are you sure we're the only ones here?" "Of course we are," he said quickly, dropping the suitcase by the bed. "Look, I know it's creepy, but it's just an old house. Old houses feel like this. Drafty floors, weird smells, paintings that stare, standard horror movie stuff. Don't let it get to you." Emma forced a weak laugh, but the unease clung to her like a shadow. She unpacked her bag slowly, her ears tuned to every creak and groan of the house. Each sound seemed to echo with intent, like the place was aware of them, watching, listening. Later, as they sat together in the sitting room with a bottle of cheap wine, Daniel tried to lighten the mood. He joked about ghosts and haunted houses, but Emma noticed how often his eyes flicked toward the windows, as if he too felt the weight of invisible eyes pressing in from the dark. At one point, she caught him staring at the ceiling, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" she asked. "I thought I heard footsteps." He shook his head. "Probably just the house settling." But when the sound came again, slow, deliberate creaks overhead, Emma's skin crawled. The footsteps moved from one side of the room to the other, then stopped directly above them. Daniel jumped up, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll check it out." Emma grabbed his arm. "No, please don't leave me here." He hesitated, then nodded. Together they climbed the stairs once more. The corridor above was silent, the air heavier, colder. They checked the guest rooms one by one, empty. Each bed was untouched, each dresser coated in thick dust. But when they reached the last door at the end of the hall, Emma felt her chest tighten. Something about this room was wrong. The door stood slightly ajar, and from the darkness inside came a faint sound, like breathing. Daniel pushed the door open, shining the flashlight inside. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating bare floorboards and a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. The reflection twisted strangely in the glass, showing their faces pale and distorted. "No one here," Daniel whispered, though his voice trembled. But Emma's eyes remained locked on the mirror. For just a second, she thought she saw something else in the reflection, a figure standing behind them, watching. She spun around. The hallway was empty. The night settled heavily over the house, draping every room in shadows too thick for the weak lamps to cut through. Daniel had insisted they both try to get some sleep, but Emma lay awake, her eyes wide open in the unfamiliar bed. The silence pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket, broken only by the occasional groan of the house, as if the timbers themselves shifted in restless slumber. She stared at the ceiling, the pale outline barely visible in the dark. It felt wrong. Not just the room, not just the house, everything. The silence was too absolute, too heavy. In London, even in the quiet hours, there were distant car horns, the hum of life always present. Here there was nothing, not even the cry of an owl or the rustle of leaves outside. Her chest tightened as if the house itself was holding its breath. She turned onto her side, trying to shake the feeling. Daniel's slow breathing reassured her somewhat, though she noticed it sounded shallow, as if he wasn't fully asleep either. She reached for his hand, but before she could touch him, a faint sound drifted from beyond the door. A creak, then another. Someone or something was moving in the hallway. Emma froze. Her mind raced for rational explanations. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. But the steps were deliberate, slow, dragging along the wooden floorboards as though whatever was walking carried immense weight. She shook Daniel's arm urgently. "Wake up!" He stirred, groggy, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" "Listen." They both held their breath. The sound continued, a steady rhythm of footsteps, moving closer, closer, until it stopped just outside their bedroom door. Daniel sat up, his face pale in the dim light. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, gathering what courage he could, he whispered, "Stay here." He slipped quietly from the bed, grabbed the flashlight and padded toward the door. Emma wanted to scream at him not to open it, but the words stuck in her throat. Daniel pressed his ear to the door, then slowly turned the handle. The old hinges whined as the door creaked open, revealing the empty hallway. "Nothing," he whispered back to her. But his voice lacked certainty. The corridor stretched into darkness, lined with its oppressive portraits. The air was colder here, heavy with a smell like damp earth. Daniel swept the flashlight back and forth, illuminating the warped wallpaper and sagging floorboards. Emma clutched the blanket to her chest, watching from the bed. The beam of the flashlight moved across the frames on the wall, each portrait's painted eyes gleaming faintly in the light. And then Daniel froze. The last portrait, the pale woman in the dark dress, looked different. Her painted lips, once set in a grim line, now curved upward in the faintest of smiles. "Emma," Daniel whispered, backing toward the room. "We're leaving the door closed tonight." He shut it quickly, sliding the lock into place. Neither of them spoke after that. They lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to the house breathe around them. Every groan of the timbers, every faint scrape of sound in the distance, sharpened their fear until it felt unbearable. Finally, Emma's eyes grew heavy, exhaustion dragging her under despite the terror. But just before she slipped into uneasy sleep, she saw it. The curtains across the window shifted, though the glass was shut tight. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. Through the thin fabric, two faint shapes appeared, round, unblinking eyes. They pressed against the glass, glowing faintly in the moonlight, staring directly at her. Her scream tore through the silence, waking Daniel instantly. He rushed to the window, yanking the curtains aside. But the glass was empty, nothing but the dark garden beyond. Emma trembled violently, her hands clutching the sheets. "I swear I saw them, eyes watching me." Daniel wrapped his arms around her, though she felt the tension in his body, the way his heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't believe it was just her imagination. He had seen the faint smear on the glass, a mark like the outline of a face pressed too close. The House That Watches You, Part 1, The Arrival. Expanded, Section 4, Final. The room felt colder after Emma's scream, as though the very walls had inhaled sharply and were holding that breath, waiting. Daniel pulled the curtains shut again, forcing a reassuring smile onto his face, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Probably just reflections, or maybe a trick of the light, he whispered, but his voice cracked, thin and unconvincing. Emma shook her head violently. "No, Daniel. They were there. I saw them, right against the glass." He didn't argue, but the unease in his eyes was unmistakable. He switched on the flashlight again and ran the beam across every corner of the room, under the bed, along the walls, even the wardrobe. Nothing, just dust, shadows, and silence. Yet the silence felt heavier. Now, like a presence lingered, just beyond the edge of the light, retreating when they looked, but always watching. "Let's just try to sleep," Daniel muttered, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than her. They lay down again, but neither could close their eyes. Emma kept glancing toward the curtains, half expecting to see them bulge inward, from an invisible face pressing against the glass. Daniel stared at the door, the locked handle glinting faintly in the dim light. Then came the whisper, so soft, so faint. Emma thought at first it was her imagination. A single word carried through the room like breath on her ear. "Stay." She bolted upright, clutching Daniel's arm. "Did you hear that?" He frowned. "What?" Before she could answer, the whisper came again, louder this time, drawn out, echoing faintly through the walls. "Stay." The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the hallway, from the floorboards, from the very air itself. Emma's pulse thundered. "It doesn't want us to leave." Daniel grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the door. The beam trembled as the handle rattled. Slowly, deliberately, the lock began to twist. "No!" Daniel hissed, rushing forward. He held the handle tight, forcing it back into place, his knuckles white. Something on the other side tugged once, twice, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps. She clutched the quilt to her chest, rocking slightly. "Daniel, please, let's leave. Right now. I don't care if it's midnight, we can't stay here." He opened his mouth to agree, but the house answered for him. From above them, in the attic, came a thunderous crash, as if something enormous had been dropped onto the floor. Dust sifted down from the ceiling in lazy spirals. Emma screamed, covering her ears. The crash was followed by footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps, pacing back and forth above their heads. Daniel shone the flashlight toward the ceiling, though it revealed nothing but cracked plaster. His face had gone pale, his lips trembling. And then slowly the footsteps stopped. Silence again. The air was so still Emma could hear her own heartbeat hammering in her chest. For a moment she thought it was over, that whatever stalked them had retreated. But then came the softest sound yet, and somehow the most terrifying. A knock. 3 deliberate knocks from the inside of the wall right beside her bed. Emma shrieked and stumbled back, colliding with Daniel. He held her tightly, eyes wide with terror. The knocking came again, faster, insistent, as though something inside the walls was trying to get out. The flashlight flickered violently, plunging them into momentary darkness. When it steadied again, Emma gasped. Every portrait in the hallway, outside their door, dozens of them, was now hanging slightly tilted, as though they had all turned to watch. Daniel slammed the curtains shut, yanked the blankets over them both, and held her as tightly as he could. Neither of them slept for the rest of the night. And as dawn finally bled pale light through the curtains, Emma realized with a sickening certainty that the house had not been trying to scare them away. It wanted them to stay. Daniel hardly slept that night. Every creak of the old house, every faint whisper of wind against the broken shutters made him jolt awake. Emma stirred beside him, her breaths uneven, like she too was locked inside some half-conscious nightmare. At one point, just before dawn, Daniel swore he heard footsteps pacing the hallway outside their bedroom. He sat upright, his pulse racing, but when he pulled the door open, there was nothing, just the cold, endless corridor stretching into darkness. Morning did not bring comfort. The house looked even more sinister, bathed in the weak gray light. Paint peeled from the walls in curling strips, revealing older layers beneath, as though the place had shed countless skins, but never rid itself of decay. The air smelled of damp wood and something sour, like rot that had seeped deep into the foundations. While Emma made a half-hearted attempt at breakfast with the little food they'd brought, Daniel explored further. He wandered into rooms they hadn't seen the night before. A dining room where chairs stood askew, one still bearing the imprint of someone who had once sat there too long ago. A study where dusty books lined the shelves and an open ledger. On the desk displayed names of people neither of them recognized, along with dates that stretched back nearly 2 centuries. Some names had been crossed out in thick black ink, others faded into smudges. But one entry chilled him, written in faint handwriting. The last date was only 3 years ago. When Emma entered the study, Daniel pointed to it. Someone was here. Recently. Emma shook her head, clutching her arms. No one lives here. Look at this place, it's falling apart. But Daniel couldn't shake the thought that someone had, at least for a while, made this house their own. And maybe still did. They decided to leave the study behind, but unease followed them like a shadow. Later that afternoon, while Emma unpacked in the bedroom, Daniel ventured outside to gather firewood. The surrounding land stretched, barren and strange, an overgrown garden that ended abruptly in dense woods. The trees loomed tall, twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers, and between them he thought he saw movement. At first he dismissed it as wind, but the longer he stared, the more convinced he became. Something stood among the trees, pale and unmoving, watching him. Heart hammering, Daniel dropped the wood and staggered back toward the house. When he glanced again, the figure was gone. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and shadows grew long, Emma grew restless. She claimed she kept hearing whispering behind the walls, like faint voices murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. Daniel tried to calm her, but secretly, he had heard them too. It was like the house itself was breathing, whispering, feeding on their fear. By nightfall, both were on edge. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting tall, shifting shadows across the room. Daniel tried to read one of the old books from the study, but the words blurred, and the pages seemed to crawl with shapes that weren't letters at all. Emma sat silently by the fire, staring at the window. Then she whispered, "Daniel, they're here again." He looked up sharply. "Who?" She raised a trembling finger toward the glass. Daniel followed her gaze and froze. Outside the window, half hidden in the darkness, were not one but 3 sets of eyes, glowing faintly, fixed directly on the house. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The 3 sets of eyes did not blink, did not waver. They simply stared as though whoever, or whatever they belonged to, had been waiting for this very moment. Emma gripped his arm so tightly her nails dug into his skin. "Daniel, tell me you see them too." "I see them," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Neither of them moved. For a few long seconds, the only sound in the room was their own ragged breathing. Then, as if reacting to their fear, the eyes shifted. Not closer, not further away, just a subtle tilt, as if the heads watching them had cocked slightly to the side in unison. Emma let out a muffled sob and buried her face against Daniel's shoulder. His own body screamed to run, but his mind locked in horror. Slowly, he forced himself to step closer to the window. As he did, the fire flickered violently, plunging the room into brief darkness. When the light returned, the eyes were gone. Emma lifted her head, trembling. They vanished." Daniel swallowed hard. "No, they're still out there, just hiding." Neither of them slept much that night. Every gust of wind rattled the windows, every shadow seemed alive. Daniel kept the fire burning as long as he could, but even its warmth felt alien now, as if the flames themselves were feeding on something unseen. By morning, Emma had grown pale and weak, complaining of a splitting headache. She claimed she'd heard whispers all night long, calling her name, sometimes in his voice, sometimes in a voice she didn't recognize. Daniel tried to reassure her, but deep down he felt the same pull, as though the house wanted them to surrender, to listen, to stay. Later that day, Daniel ventured back into the woods, determined to prove to himself that it was all in their minds. The air outside was still, unnaturally quiet. Birds did not sing, leaves barely stirred. He pushed deeper into the tree line, each step crunching on brittle twigs that seemed too loud in the silence. Then he saw it. A clearing. In the center stood a circle of stones, blackened as if from fire long extinguished. Around the stones, crude carvings marked the trees, spirals, jagged shapes, and something that resembled an eye carved over and over again, gouged deep into the bark. The sight froze him in place. The symbols matched those he'd glimpsed in the ledger's margins back in the study. Whoever had written those names had also been here, carving these warnings or invitations into the forest. Daniel's stomach twisted as he realized the truth. The house wasn't just a structure. It was part of something older, something that stretched beyond its walls into the land itself. And as he turned to leave, a sound drifted through the trees. A child's laughter, high, distant, but unmistakable. Daniel spun, heart hammering. The clearing was empty, but the laughter continued, circling him, moving between the trees, though no figure was visible. He stumbled backward, tripping on a root, his breath ragged. Finally, when he burst back through the tree line and saw the crumbling house, the laughter stopped, cut off mid-echo, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. When he staggered inside, Emma was sitting upright on the bed, eyes wide, skin clammy. "They were here," she whispered before he could speak. "Inside, watching me." Daniel froze at Emma's words. Her face was drained of all color, her eyes glassy, as if she had seen something she couldn't fully explain. "Inside?" he asked cautiously. "I woke up and couldn't move. And then, shadows, standing at the edge of the room. Not just one, many, watching, whispering. I thought it was a nightmare, but I was awake. Daniel, I was awake. Daniel's stomach churned. He wanted to dismiss it, to say it was stress, exhaustion, anything rational. But he couldn't ignore the fact that he had heard the laughter in the woods, had seen the glowing eyes. Whatever was happening wasn't just in their heads. He sat beside her, gripping her cold hand. We'll leave tomorrow. First thing. We don't need to stay here another night. Do you think it'll let us leave? The way she said it made Daniel's blood run cold. That night, neither of them dared to sleep. The house seemed alive with sound, faint footsteps above them, the groan of old beams, the whisper of voices that carried through the vents. The fire kept dying no matter how much wood Daniel added, leaving long stretches of oppressive darkness broken only by the pale moonlight seeping through the cracked shutters. Daniel turned to find her pointing at the wall opposite the bed. Slowly, shapes began to form across the peeling wallpaper, dark stains bleeding through, stretching into long finger-like smears. They curled downward, like hands dragging themselves out of the plaster. Do you see it? Emma whispered, voice shaking. Daniel wanted to say no, but the shapes pulsed, shifted, as if straining against the wall. One of the black marks suddenly stretched too far. Daniel lunged forward, grabbing Emma, pulling her back. The stain recoiled, but the others remained, twitching faintly, their presence undeniable. They stumbled into the hallway, hearts pounding, and nearly screamed when the door behind them slammed shut on its own, followed by the unmistakable creak of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward them from the far end. Emma clung to Daniel's arm, whispering over and over, "Don't look, don't look." But Daniel did. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the moonlight, stood a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its face obscured in shadow. It did not move, yet somehow the air around them thickened, pressing down like a suffocating weight. Then, in the stillness, the figure tilted its head, the exact same motion the glowing eyes had made outside the window. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. He blinked, and the figure was gone, but the footsteps continued. Closer now. Emma nodded slowly. It felt like something was pressing down on my chest. Emma stared at him, her lips trembling. He didn't answer. Around midnight, Emma gasped, tapping the floor like a real hand. The sound echoed through the empty corridor. Daniel froze at Emma's words. Her face was drained of all color, her eyes glassy, as if she had seen something she couldn't fully explain. "Inside?" he asked cautiously. Emma nodded slowly. I woke up and couldn't move. It felt like something was pressing down on my chest. And then, shadows, standing at the edge of the room. Not just one, many, watching, whispering. I thought it was a nightmare, but I was awake, Daniel. I was awake. Daniel's stomach churned. He wanted to dismiss it, to say it was stress, exhaustion, anything rational. But he couldn't ignore the fact that he had heard the laughter in the woods, had seen the glowing eyes. Whatever was happening wasn't just in their heads. He sat beside her, gripping her cold hand. We'll leave tomorrow. First thing. We don't need to stay here another night. Emma stared at him, her lips trembling. Do you think it'll let us leave? The way she said it made Daniel's blood run cold. He didn't answer. That night, neither of them dared to sleep. The house seemed alive with sound, faint footsteps above them, the groan of old beams, the whisper of voices that carried through the vents. The fire kept dying no matter how much wood Daniel added, leaving long stretches of oppressive darkness broken only by the pale moonlight seeping through the cracked shutters. Around midnight, Emma gasped. Daniel turned to find her pointing at the wall opposite the bed. Slowly, shapes began to form across the peeling wallpaper, dark stains bleeding through, stretching into long finger-like smears. They curled downward, like hands dragging themselves out of the plaster. Do you see it? Emma whispered, voice shaking. Daniel wanted to say no, but the shapes pulsed, shifted, as if straining against the wall. One of the black marks suddenly stretched too far, tapping the floor like a real hand. Daniel lunged forward, grabbing Emma, pulling her back. The stain recoiled, But the others remained, twitching faintly, their presence undeniable. They stumbled into the hallway, hearts pounding, and nearly screamed when the door behind them slammed shut on its own. The sound echoed through the empty corridor, followed by the unmistakable creak of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward them from the far end. Emma clung to Daniel's arm, whispering over and over, "Don't look, don't look." But Daniel did. At the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the moonlight, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, its face obscured in shadow. It did not move, yet somehow the air around them thickened, pressing down like a suffocating weight. Then, in the stillness, the figure tilted its head, the exact same motion the glowing eyes had made outside the window. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. He blinked and the figure was gone. But the footsteps continued, closer.